Married for 5 years, I never dared to call and bother my husband during his working hours. The night my car was crushed in the pouring rain, the driver who caused the accident called her boyfriend to handle it. But the moment I saw the man step out and wrap his coat around her, I froze and dropped my phone. If you empathize with this story, please share your thoughts below the video. Do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel to continue listening to more emotional real-life stories every day. The Seattle rain had been pouring down since 7 inches the evening, so thick that the street lights on the SR 520 bridge were reduced to blurry halos behind my windshield. I had left the pharmacy less than 10 minutes ago, and Harrison's stomach medication was sitting neatly on the passenger seat. His doctor had warned him not to drink coffee on an empty stomach, but he never remembered. For the past 5 years, the one who always remembered for him was me. I slowed down as I approached the intersection ahead because the road was slick and traffic was backing up under the heavy downpour. Just as the light turned red, a white SUV sped in from the right like it had lost its brakes. I only had time to see the headlights blinding my eyes before hearing a horrifying crash. My car was thrown sideways, spinning halfway around before slamming hard into the concrete median. The seat belt tightened across my chest, knocking the breath out of me, and my forehead slammed into the steering wheel hard enough to make my vision go black. A sickening sound came from my left knee, quieter than the screeching of crushed metal, but distinct enough to chill my blood. I knew my old injury had torn open again, even before the wave of agony hit me. When I opened my eyes, blood from my eyebrow was dripping down into my eyelashes, mixing with the rain blowing in through the shattered window. I tried to move, but my left leg was pinned between the seat and the crumpled door. The pain shot from my knee straight to my hip, making my hands turn icy cold, even though my whole body felt burning hot. My phone had fallen to the floorboard, its screen spiderweb with cracks, but still glowing. I reached down for what felt like an eternity until my fingertips brushed the jagged glass, sharp as a knife. Harrison's name was at the top of my contacts, right above the single phone number I had memorized long ago. My finger hovered over the call button for a very long time. 5 years ago, right after we signed our marriage license, he had told me in a perfectly flat voice that while he was on duty, I should never call him about personal matters. Everything could wait. At the time, I laughed and joked, asking what if the house caught on fire. He looked at me without a hint of amusement and told me to call the fire department. I had thought it was just the quirk of a man who lived strictly by the rules. Later, I realized he was not exaggerating. I once ran a fever of 104 degrees in the middle of the night, but called a cab to the hospital by myself. I had gone alone to the cemetery on the anniversary of my father's death. Every time I wanted to call, I reminded myself that he was doing more important work. Tonight was no different. Even though my leg hurt so much that my teeth chattered, I still did not press the call button. I placed the phone face down on my thigh and tried to pull my leg out of the crushed door. The jagged metal sliced through my skirt and blood ran down my calf, pooling in my waterlogged shoe. I bit my lip until I tasted iron. Some habits, when repeated for too long, become instinct. My instinct was to never bother Harrison. The door of the white SUV across from me popped open, and a young woman in a beige trench coat stepped out. Her long hair plastered to her face by the rain. She ran toward me looking panicked. But before she even reached my car, she pulled out her phone to make a call. I heard her speaking rapidly, apologizing, saying she did not see the red light and panicked because of the heavy rain. I thought she was calling the police or paramedics until her voice suddenly went soft. "Harrison, I caused an accident. I am so scared. Can you come to me?" His name pierced through the sound of the rain and stabbed directly into my ears. My hands, which had been trying to pry my door open, stopped completely. I looked closely at her face through the smeared makeup and recognized Chloe Sinclair. She was a famous travel vlogger with millions of followers who had recently been featured in the public relations campaigns for Harrison's military division. I had seen her photo in the project files he brought home. I had also seen her name light up on his phone screen late at night. Every time that happened, I told myself it was just work. A man like Harrison did not like to explain himself, so I learned not to ask. I even felt petty for caring about a name in a text message. But right now, Chloe was standing in the pouring rain, calling my husband with the voice of someone absolutely certain he would come. She did not call him Colonel Sterling, nor did she use his full name like his colleagues did. Just Harrison, spoken with an intimacy that made my 5 years of marriage feel like a stranger's illusion. Chloe had not seen me yet. She turned her back to my crushed car and cried as she spoke into the phone, saying she was not hurt, but was terrified. Something terrible had happened to the person in the other car, begging him to come quickly. Whatever the person on the other end said made her calm down. She nodded out of habit even though he could not see her and then hung up. When she finally turned around, she leaned down near my shattered window and asked if I could hear her. She told me she had called someone to come handle it. I looked at her and asked very quietly who she had called. Chloe paused for a fraction of a second, but then replied that it was her boyfriend who worked nearby and would be there soon. Her answer was light, as if there was absolutely nothing to hide. I wanted to ask for his name, but my throat was entirely choked up. Perhaps I was terrified she would say the exact name I was thinking of. 15 minutes later, a black government Tahoe tore through the curtain of rain and pulled up. I recognized it while it was still hundreds of feet away. The doors bore the dispatch insignia of Harrison's command unit. I looked at the cracked clock on my dashboard and the number 15 mocked me. In 5 years of marriage, I had never once gotten him to show up that fast. The door opened and Harrison stepped out in a dark gray dress shirt. He was not wearing a raincoat, so within seconds, the shoulders of his shirt were soaked dark. His posture was as straight and his strides as steady as always. The moment Chloe saw him, she ran over, her face crumpling with grievance. He did not ask what happened first. He took off the military jacket he was holding and draped it over her shoulders, his voice carrying through the rain. He told her she was supposed to go with her driver. Chloe lowered her head and said she thought the rain was light, that she never expected this to happen. Harrison looked her up and down, and asked if she was hurt anywhere. She shook her head, then leaned closer into his jacket. I was sitting less than 40 feet away from them, my knee still pinned in the door frame, blood still dripping down to my ankle. After a moment, Chloe finally mentioned that she thought she hit the other person's car pretty badly. Harrison turned his head and looked toward me. His eyes swept over the crushed front end of my car, the shattered glass, and the dark space behind my steering wheel. I looked straight back at him. In that fraction of a second, I still hoped he would recognize the license plate or the small charm hanging from the rearview mirror that I had bought with my own hands. But his gaze lingered for less than 2 seconds. He turned to the lieutenant who had just stepped out of the vehicle and told him to stay behind, call a tow truck, and coordinate with the highway patrol. Lieutenant Miller nodded and jogged toward my car. Harrison guided Chloe toward the government vehicle, his voice dropping low as he told her to get in first because she was shivering. I watched his hand rest on the small of her back. That was how he had supported me exactly once on our wedding day when I tripped on the steps outside the courthouse. I had been happy for that entire day just because of that one small gesture. It turns out that when tenderness is given to someone you love, it is an instinct. But when given to someone seen merely as an obligation, it becomes a luxury that the person must memorize for a lifetime. The Tahoe started up and pulled a U-turn, its red taillights fading into the rain, looking exactly like streaks of blood being washed away by the water. I did not call his name, even though all it would take was one scream and Harrison would hear me. I did not even try to wave my hand out the broken window. Inside me, something had just snapped, but it did not make a sound like the bone in my knee. The lieutenant ran over, leaned down, and asked if I was conscious, promising to call an ambulance immediately. I looked at him, then picked up my own phone. My voice was so calm that I found it foreign. I told him I could call them myself. When the 911 dispatcher answered, I clearly stated my location and the extent of my injuries. I did not mention my husband, nor did I say that the vehicle that had just left the scene belonged to him. After hanging up, I looked at the bag of stomach medicine on the passenger seat. The paper bag was soaked with rainwater, the box inside crushed at one corner. Suddenly, I found myself ridiculous. While he rushed out to shield someone else from the rain, I was still carrying his medicine home for him. At that exact moment, I finally understood. It was not that Harrison was forbidden from taking personal calls. It was just that my number was never worth breaking the rules for. The rescue crew had to use the jaws of life for nearly 20 minutes to pry the crushed door off my leg. When they pulled me out, the pain turned my mind entirely white. A female paramedic took one look at my wound, instantly pressed a thick gauze pad against my knee, and almost shouted at me, asking why I had not called sooner when I was losing so much blood. Lying on the stretcher, watching the raindrops fall from my hair onto the white blanket, I answered very quietly that I had forgotten. The truth was, I had not forgotten. I was just so used to enduring things on my own that I no longer knew when I was allowed to cry for help. Inside the ambulance, the nurse asked if I had any family with me. I looked at my dead phone screen and shook my head. She asked where my husband was. It took me a few seconds to answer that he was busy. I had used that excuse way too many times. When I attended Gallus alone, I said he was busy. When I was hospitalized alone, I said he was busy. It reached a point where sometimes I could not distinguish whether he was truly busy or simply absent from my life. The attending doctor stated that my left knee had a deep laceration. My old cartilage injury had ruptured again and there were signs of a hairline fracture. I required 37 stitches. While administering the local anesthesia, the doctor mentioned that if I had been delayed by another half hour, the risk of permanent nerve damage would have been extremely high. I just nodded and asked for a cup of water. Perhaps they thought I was tough, but only I knew that my body was in so much pain that there was no room left for emotions. As night fell, the rain outside the window lightened. The hospital room was filled only with the rhythmic beeping of the IV pump and the squeak of nurses' shoes in the hallway. I turned my phone on multiple times. There were no missed calls. There were no text messages from Harrison. Perhaps he assumed the accident victim had been handled perfectly by his lieutenant, or maybe he forgot about it the moment he got close to safety. I stared at his name in my contacts, then thought back to the day we signed our marriage papers. That day in Seattle was slightly sunny. I wore the ivory dress that my grandfather had bought for me. Harrison arrived exactly on time. His dress shirt pressed and his shoes polished so perfectly. They did not have a single speck of dust. After signing the papers, he handed me a pre-drafted agreement, its contents shorter than a standard apartment lease. He stated that our relationship would remain undisclosed. Neither party would interfere in the other private life. And during his working hours, I was never to call him about personal matters. I read down to the final line and asked him what the last clause meant. He looked at the note that read, "No romantic feelings should develop," his expression remaining completely cold. He told me this marriage was arranged by our families and keeping a distance would make things easier for both of us. At the time, I smiled and assured him not to worry, saying I did not have the free time to fall for someone as unapproachable as him. I lied on my very first day as a wife. I had liked him even before we formally met. When I was 19, Harrison had carried an injured child out of a flooded town in Colorado. That image appeared on the evening news, and I sat in front of the screen, unable to look away. I thought, a man brave enough to rush into raging floodwaters must have a very warm heart. It was only after marrying him that I realized a person could be kind to the entire world, yet bitterly cold to the one sleeping beside him. For 5 years, I broke none of his rules. I kept our marriage a secret, never showed up at his base, and never asked about his late nights. I learned to brew his French press coffee at exactly 180 degrees because of his sensitive stomach. I memorized which pills had to be taken before meals and which came after. Once he ran a high fever in the middle of the night, and I sat up changing his cold compresses until dawn. When he woke up, he only asked why I was not sleeping, then turned his face to the wall. I used to think affection was like warm water. If it kept flowing long enough, even stone would soften. But stone does not soften. Only the person holding the stone for too long becomes cold along with it. Tonight in the pouring rain was the first time I saw that clearly. I did not lose to Chloe because she was younger or prettier. I lost because Harrison wanted to be by her side, and with me he never wanted to be. At nearly 4 inches the morning, I requested to be discharged against medical advice. I signed the liability waiver and called a cab back to our military housing near Joint Base Lewis McChord. The driver glanced at the dried blood on my skirt through the rearview mirror several times, but asked nothing. When the car stopped in front of the gate, it took me nearly 5 minutes just to step out. Every time I put weight on my leg, it felt like needles driving straight into my bones. The house was so dark and quiet that the click of the door lock echoed loudly. I did not turn on the living room lights. I simply leaned against the wall and limped slowly toward the study where a safe was hidden behind the bookshelf. The code was Harrison's birthday. I used to think of it as a private secret between a husband and wife. Now, I only found it pathetic because everything in this house revolved around him. The divorce petition lay in the bottom drawer, drafted by me 3 months ago. Back then, I had printed 2 copies but lacked the courage to sign them. I thought I was just being overly sensitive, telling myself that a military spouse had to know how to wait. I wondered if one day he would finally realize that someone in this house was always waiting for him. Tonight, I no longer wanted to know the answer. I switched on the desk lamp and sat down, Harrison's fountain pen rested in its holder, its cap engraved with his unit insignia. I uncapped it and signed my name at the bottom of the page. My handwriting trembled slightly because the painkillers had worn off, but every letter was clear. Elena Ramirez. Just 2 words. Yet they felt like iron nails pinning 5 years of my life down onto the paper. I thought I would cry when I signed it. During the nights I slept alone. I used to imagine begging him to stay. I feared my own weakness, terrified that just one gentle word from him would melt all my resolve. But when the moment actually came, I shed no tears. People only cry when they still hold on to hope. I was hurting so deeply that there was absolutely nothing left to hope for. After signing, I went into the walk-in closet. The 3 racks on the left held Harrison's uniforms, dress shirts, and jackets. I had organized his clothes by season, color, and deployment schedule. My section was confined to a small corner on the right, not because I had few clothes, but because during our first year of marriage, Harrison had looked at the closet and remarked that having too much stuff made it look chaotic. From that day on, I moved most of my clothes to the guest room. I learned to shrink myself little by little so the house would perfectly fit his habits. Bright dresses were swapped for muted tones, sweet perfumes were put away because he disliked strong scents. Even the sound of my slippers against the floor was kept as quiet as possible when he was resting. I lived in this house for 5 years, but never dared to let myself take up too much space. I did not take any clothes from the closet. I went into the storage room and dragged my vintage hiking backpack out of the corner. It was covered in dust, but the straps were still sturdy. This was the backpack I had bought in my senior year at the University of Washington, preparing for a geological research expedition in the Cascade Range. I had been selected for a landslide survey team, but canceled my trip a week before departure because Grandpa Arthur called me about meeting Harrison's family. I unzipped the backpack and tossed in a few changes of clothes, my passport, and a hard drive containing my academic research. My old geology field journal lay at the bottom of the bag. Its pages yellowed. I flipped to the first page and saw my own handwriting from 6 years ago. The goal is to stand on a truly high mountain peak through my own abilities. I stared at that sentence for a very long time. I had abandoned the girl who wrote it inside Harrison's house for way too many years. I did not take any jewelry or the designer bags his secretary usually sent over on holidays. They never truly belonged to me. I simply slid my wedding ring off my finger and placed it next to the divorce papers. There was a small sticky note left on the desk. I thought about leaving a message, but ultimately just wrote that the stomach medicine was in the second drawer on the left. Even as I was leaving, I still remembered he needed his pills. Realizing this made me laugh out loud, but the sound quickly turned into a pained gasp. I crumpled the note and threw it in the trash. From now on, wherever he heard it was no longer my business. Before walking out the door, I passed the kitchen. His thermal mug was still on the counter. A sticky note on the outside read, "Water at 180 degrees, steep for 4 minutes." Inside the fridge were 7 low-sodium meal preps I had made yesterday afternoon. I used to imagine that love meant remembering tiny details like these. But if only one person remembers, it ceases to be love. It becomes a habit of servitude, dressed up in a beautiful name. The sky was nearing dawn when I pulled the front door shut. I did not lock it because my house key was already sitting on the desk. The backpack weighed barely 20 pounds, but the injury in my leg made every step feel like I was dragging the entire house behind me. I did not look back. There are some places where looking back, even once, will break your resolve. The taxi pulled up to the gate at 5:40 the morning. The driver asked where I was heading. I looked at the city brightening after the storm and told him to go to SeaTac Airport. He asked what time my flight was. I shook my head because I did not have a ticket yet. All I knew was that I had to leave this house before Harrison returned. As the car drove away, I rested my head against the window. My knee throbbed violently, but my heart felt unusually at peace. I used to think leaving someone meant losing the entire world. It was only when I finally stepped out that I realized the only thing I was leaving behind was the room I had locked myself inside for far too long. There were so many places ahead that I had never been. And for the first time in 5 years, I had the right to choose my own path. 3 days after I left, Harrison finally returned to the house near the base. He finished his inspections earlier than expected, so he dropped by to change his uniform, planning to head back to the command center that afternoon. He unlocked the door with his own key, stepped into the living room, and instantly froze. The furniture was exactly where it belonged, the curtains were half drawn, and his slippers were placed neatly under the shoe rack. Everything looked perfectly normal at a glance. Yet the house completely lacked the feeling of a living, breathing person. He stood in the doorway for a few seconds before realizing the scent of warm food and familiar laundry detergent had vanished. Harrison walked straight to the kitchen. The thermal mug was still on the counter, the sticky note bearing my handwriting about the temperature and steeping time still attached. He popped the lid and saw that the coffee inside was ice cold, a thin film floating on the surface. The meal preps in the fridge still had their date labels, but no new ones had been added. He frowned, opening the medicine cabinet below, a place that previously always held a full stock of antacids and vitamins. The last bottle was empty, leaving only a crushed cardboard box shoved into the corner. He pulled out his phone and called me. A cold, automated voice stated the number was disconnected. Harrison stared at the screen for a few seconds, then dialed again, as if assuming it was just a network error. The result was the same. He was not immediately worried. He just felt an intense wave of annoyance because an unexpected variable had abruptly disrupted his perfectly structured routine. To him, I had never been someone who disappeared without a report. It was only when he walked into the study that he saw the stack of papers on the desk. The lamp was still on. His fountain pen lay beside it, and the divorce petition bore my signature on the final page. Harrison picked it up and read from beginning to end, even though the contents were no different from the agreement we had established years ago. Separate assets remained separate, no disputes, and no demands for alimony. My side had a signature. His side was left blank. He read it a second time, then set the papers down. His first emotion was not pain, it was anger. He figured I was overreacting to some incident, acting like a subordinate abandoning their post without authorization. He immediately called Lieutenant Miller and gave a brief order to find out where Elena was. Lieutenant Miller hesitated before asking if everything was all right with Mrs. Sterling. Harrison replied that she had left a divorce petition and disconnected her phone. After the call, he went into the walk-in closet. His clothes were still perfectly aligned, every dress shirt color coordinated as always. The small section on the right was almost entirely intact. It was only missing a few simple outfits whose shapes he could not even recall. The dresses he had bought for me still hung there. The jewelry was still in its boxes, and the expensive bracelet that had never been worn still had its price tag attached. He stared at it for a while, sensing something was missing, but unable to name it. It was only when he opened the storage room that he realized the vintage hiking backpack was gone. Harrison never knew I owned that backpack. Just as he never knew I had studied geology, planned to survey the mountains, or dreamed of working out in the field. After 5 years of living together, he knew I did not eat spicy food and that I read before bed. The rest of my life had left absolutely no trace in his memory. That realization unsettled him in a very strange way. It was like staring at a familiar room and suddenly discovering a door he had never opened. That night, Harrison stayed at the house instead of returning to the base. He boiled water and tried to make his own coffee. The first batch was too strong and bitter. The second was so weak it had no aroma. He stared at the sticky note reading 180 degrees for a very long time, realizing he had no idea how many minutes to wait after the water boiled to achieve that exact temperature. Before, all he had to do was sit down, and a perfect cup was placed at his right hand. He had never once asked how I managed to get everything just right. The next morning, Harrison went to the mess hall on base. It was a rare occurrence for him to appear during breakfast hours, and a few people shot him surprised glances. He grabbed a bowl of oatmeal and some toast, sitting alone at a corner table. The oatmeal was bland, the toast was cold, and the coffee was overly acidic. He took a few bites and set his fork down. The image of the warm pumpkin porridge I used to make on days his stomach acted up flashed through his mind. Harrison hated that feeling, so he stood up abruptly. He told himself his palate had just changed over the past year, completely unrelated to whether I was home or not. By afternoon, a severe stomach cramp hit him right in the middle of a briefing. He sat perfectly straight until the meeting concluded, then returned to his office and opened his personal medicine drawer. It was totally empty. On the 15th of every month, I usually came by quietly to restock his medicine, but this month, no one had come. Lieutenant Miller brought him pills from the base clinic along with a glass of ice water. After swallowing them, the cramps flared up even worse. He kept his face neutral, but his hand gripped the edge of the desk white-knuckled. Lieutenant Miller noticed his pale complexion, and carefully mentioned that Mrs. Sterling used to bring him a small thermos of warm water. Harrison looked up, shooting him a glare that instantly silenced the lieutenant. But when left alone, Harrison stared at the cold glass of water for a very long time. 7 days later, Lieutenant Miller brought in a background file. He reported that I had left Seattle on an early morning flight, flown to Denver, and then traveled into the mountains. My personal bank accounts had been cleared, my phone number was canceled, and my health insurance had been rerouted to a new employer. I had taken absolutely zero shared assets. I only used my own money and followed a job lead from an old university professor. Harrison flipped through the pages, stopping at the education section. I had graduated at the top of my class in engineering geology, authored a thesis on landslide prevention in the northern ranges, and was selected for an elite survey team in the Cascades. That opportunity had been rejected right around the time we were preparing to get married. Lieutenant Miller quietly noted that according to university records, Mrs. Sterling gave up a highly prestigious research opportunity. Harrison did not reply. He just stared at the timeline for a very long time. He remembered the day our families met. I sat next to Grandpa Arthur wearing a pale ivory dress, smiling at him, even though he barely spoke a word. When Grandpa Arthur asked about my plans after the wedding, I simply answered that I would settle in Seattle to make my husband's career more convenient. Back then, Harrison thought it was a highly logical choice. He had never once asked what that choice forced me to leave behind. That night, he returned to the empty house. Out of habit, he reached out to flip the switch for the small hallway lamp, but the bulb was burnt out. In the past, I had always replaced it the moment it started flickering. He did not even know where the spare bulbs were kept. Harrison stood in the dark, looking toward the bedroom. The right half of the bed was perfectly smooth and cold. He suddenly wondered if in the past whenever he came home late, the side where I slept was this cold. The question lingered for only a few seconds, but kept him awake the entire night. He tossed and turned, reaching his hand out to the other side of the bed multiple times. His fingertips only met cold sheets. There was no person, and there was no warmth. For the first time, Harrison understood that a house could be so quiet you could clearly hear your own breathing. He did not call it missing me yet. He only knew that from the day I left, everything in his life had started slipping out of alignment. 2 months later, Grandpa Arthur was rushed to Madigan Army Medical Center, suffering from severe chest pains. At the time, I was out in a remote mountain town with my survey team. Cell service was virtually non-existent due to the high elevation. The first person to reach me was my sister, Maria. Her voice was shaking so violently I had to make her repeat herself twice. Elena, Grandpa is having a massive heart attack. The doctors say it is critical. I was standing at the edge of a massive fissure on the mountain side. Yet, in that moment, the ground beneath my feet felt like it was vanishing. I rushed down the mountain that same afternoon. The drive back to Seattle took much longer than usual because of heavy rain and minor mudslides along the route. From the car, I repeatedly called the hospital for updates. The attending physician told me Grandpa had survived the initial crisis, but his heart had suffered massive trauma and the risk of multi-organ failure was incredibly high. They suggested using a cutting-edge cardiovascular support machine currently held in the Military Medical Reserve System. If he could be put on it within 48 hours, his chances of survival would increase significantly. My family immediately filed the paperwork to request an emergency transfer of the equipment. Since Grandpa was an Army veteran, the paperwork was processed quickly. Maria stayed at the hospital while I went with the doctors to secure the necessary final approvals. I thought it was just a formality. None of us expected that a life-saving device was currently locked down under a completely different category. 3 days later, the official response came back with a massive stamp reading denied. The reason was explicitly stated: the equipment had been allocated to support a Department of Defense public relations project. That project was a documentary film showcasing military medical tech featuring Chloe Sinclair as the guest host. The machine was not being used on any patient, but it was being held strictly to serve as a visual prop for the cameras. I held the copy of the document, my hands turning ice cold. The signature at the bottom of the page belonged to Colonel Harrison Sterling. When Maria read it, she was so furious her lips trembled. She called Harrison's office but was denied access. So the next morning, she drove straight to the military base. She sat waiting in the hallway for over an hour when his office door finally opened. The first person to step out was Chloe. She was wearing a pristine white lab coat, holding a cup of coffee, her face wearing that familiar, soft smile. Seeing Maria, Chloe stopped and asked in a perfectly polite tone if she was there to see Harrison. Maria did not answer her question. She shoved the denial document right into her face. Do you know that the machine you are using for your little video project is the exact thing a sick man needs to stay alive? Chloe's expression faltered for a second, but her voice quickly softened. I am just following the production schedule set by the command. I do not have the authority to decide equipment transfers. Maria glared at her. But you do have the authority to say you do not need it to shoot a movie. Chloe bit her lip, her eyes instantly welling with tears. She claimed she had no idea the situation was that serious and did not want anyone to get hurt. The way she spoke sounded exactly like someone apologizing for dropping a trivial item, not someone holding a human being's chance at life hostage. Maria did not argue further. She shoved the door open and marched straight into Harrison's office, ignoring Lieutenant Miller's attempts to stop her. Harrison was sitting behind his desk. Several open files spread before him. He looked up, his voice turning icy. Maria, this is not a place you can just barge into whenever you please. Maria slammed the document down onto the desk, hitting it so hard a pen rolled onto the floor. She demanded, do you even know what you signed? Harrison looked at the paper and answered with complete composure. I do. Maria pointed directly at the equipment transfer line, articulating every single word. Elena's grandfather is in the ICU. The doctor said. This is his absolute best chance to survive. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his tone unwavering. Your family's request was filed 17 days after the public relations schedule was finalized. The prior request was approved following standard operating procedure. Maria let out a bitter laugh, tears spilling over her eyelashes. She asked, so, a human life has to wait in line behind her camera shots. Harrison frowned. Watch your tone. This is an officially sanctioned DoD project, not Chloe's personal errand. Maria snapped back. And my grandfather is a personal errand, so he doesn't deserve to be saved. Is that it? Harrison stated that he had the authority to request a secondary review, but could not arbitrarily break protocol just because of a family connection. That answer made Maria stare at him for a long time. Finally, she asked, do you truly think this is just about a family connection? Harrison stayed silent. Maria reached down, picked up the pen, and placed it back in front of him. Her voice dropped low, but every word carried a crushing weight. He is your wife's grandfather. The man who actually trusted you enough to think you had the decency to take care of his granddaughter. Harrison looked away and replied that Elena had left divorce papers. Maria scoffed. You haven't signed them yet. On paper, she is still your wife, but looking at the way you speak, you probably never considered her your wife to begin with. When Harrison did not respond, Maria took a step closer. Do you even know why Elena left? He claimed it was a matter between the two of them. Maria shook her head. No, it is a matter you never bothered to know. She then recounted the night of the rainstorm, the crushed car, and the 37 stitches in my knee. Harrison sat entirely frozen. Maria made it crystal clear that I had watched him arrive at the scene, wrap his coat around Chloe, and leave. I was sitting inside a mangled car less than 40 feet away from him, yet he never recognized me. She asked him, 5 years as her husband, and you did not even know what kind of car she drives. Harrison's face maintained its composed mask, but his hands tightened into fists on the desk. The memory of that rainy night rushed back to him. The crushed dark sedan, the shattered glass, and the blurry silhouette in the driver's seat. He had glanced over, but only for 2 seconds. At that exact moment, his entire focus was on Chloe, who was crying and shivering. Later, his lieutenant reported that the victim had been taken to the hospital and the injuries were not life-threatening. He had believed that report and never asked a single follow-up question. Harrison asked quietly, if she was hurt that badly, why didn't she call me? Maria looked at him like she was hearing something utterly absurd. Because you strictly forbade her from calling you about personal matters during duty hours. He argued that the rule was only meant to prevent unnecessary distractions. Maria cut him off. So, an accident that nearly crippled her leg wasn't necessary enough for you. For the first time, Harrison had absolutely no response. Maria looked back down at the document and spoke. Last time, you abandoned Elena because you assumed Chloe needed you more. This time, you are hoarding a life-saving device for her project while my grandfather waits to die. Harrison immediately defended himself, stating he was not playing favorites and everything was being executed according to proper procedure. Maria nodded very slowly. You might be perfectly right on paper, but if my grandfather dies, your precious correct procedure is just murder. With that, She turned and walked out. The office sank into a suffocating silence. Harrison sat alone for a long time before calling Lieutenant Miller in. He ordered him to reopen the equipment file and initiate a secondary emergency review protocol. Lieutenant Miller warned him that standard procedure took 7 business days, whereas the doctors were counting time in hours. Harrison stayed silent for a few seconds before replying, "Just follow the regulations." He still chose the procedure. That evening, I arrived back at the hospital. Grandpa Arthur was lying behind the ICU glass, looking frail, his chest covered in wires and tubes. I stood outside looking at him, recalling our last conversation. He had asked me if I was happy. I had smiled and told him Harrison was busy but treated me well enough. Perhaps the elderly understand far more than we give them credit for, because at the time he only sighed and held my hand for a long while. I did not know how the confrontation at the base had played out. All I knew was that the request was officially under review and the equipment could not be transferred immediately. The doctors continued with alternative treatments, but Grandpa's condition deteriorated by the hour. On the 3rd night, his blood pressure kept plummeting. I sat in the hallway, my hands clasped so tightly my nails dug into my skin. At almost 30 inches the morning, the doctors rushed into the room. The light above the door flashed red. A long, continuous alarm blared from inside. I shot up to my feet, but my knee flared with pain, causing me to stumble. Maria caught me repeating over and over that he would be fine. Both of us knew it was just a lie we used to keep each other from collapsing. At 3:17, the attending doctor stepped out. He pulled down his surgical mask and bowed his head. Sheer exhaustion etched onto his face. I did not hear his entire sentence. I only heard the words, "I am sorry." After that, every sound around me faded into nothing. Maria broke down, sobbing beside me while I just stood perfectly still, as if my body had forgotten how to react. My phone buzzed in my pocket right at that moment. The screen displayed Lieutenant Miller's name. When I answered, he told me the secondary review had been given preliminary approval, and the equipment could be transferred once the handover protocols were complete. I stared at the door of the resuscitation room and asked, "How much longer?" He paused for a few seconds before answering, "Tomorrow morning at the earliest." I did not say another word. The call disconnected itself as my arm dropped to my side. Tomorrow is a very short amount of time for the living, but it is longer than a lifetime for someone who has just stopped breathing. I walked up to the glass window and looked at Grandpa Arthur's face, now partially covered by a white sheet. It was then that I truly understood that some mistakes can never ever be fixed. 3 days after Grandpa died, his funeral was held at a military-affiliated funeral home near Arlington. The rain was not as heavy as the night of my accident. There was only a fine mist clinging to my jacket, painting everything in a cold gray tone. I stood near the casket since early morning, wearing a simple black suit, my hair tied in a low ponytail. Maria had cried until she lost her voice, and relatives we hadn't seen in years took turns holding my hands. I did not cry. The pain inside me had gone far deeper than tears. It was like a well so deep that no matter how many screams you threw down into it, no echo ever came back up. Grandpa's face behind the glass looked as gentle as if he were sleeping. I remembered those wrinkled hands guiding me through the school gates and his affectionate scolding whenever I stayed up too late studying. He used to tell me that a girl never needed to rely on anyone as long as she had a solid career and high enough self-respect. Yet he was also the one who believed Harrison was a safe harbor for me. Perhaps at the end of his life, his greatest regret was not that he misjudged a man, but that he had let me abandon my own path for a marriage. At nearly 9, Harrison appeared at the entrance of the viewing room. He was in his full dress uniform, the lapels perfectly crisp and the buttons gleaming cold against the light. People around the room cast subtle glances his way. Even though our separation was not public, anyone close to the family knew the marriage was shattered. He stood at the door for a few seconds before stepping inside. When he reached me, his voice was lower than usual. "Elena." I did not turn around immediately. I looked at Grandpa for a moment longer before turning my body. Harrison looked slightly thinner, faint dark circles under his eyes, and his expression was no longer entirely freezing. He said, "I offer my deepest condolences. I am truly sorry about Arthur." Hearing that, I simply replied, "Colonel Sterling, this is a viewing room. If you are here on official business, please step into the reception area." The way I addressed him made the muscles in his jaw lock. Over the past 5 years, no matter how angry I was, I had never called him by his rank. I always called him Harrison on the nights he came home late or whispered his name when leaving medicine on his desk. Now those letters belonged to someone else. I no longer wanted to use them for the man standing in front of me. Harrison remained silent for a few seconds before stating he was not there on official business. I looked him dead in the eyes then. In what capacity are you here? That question made him hesitate. My husband on paper? The man who signed the order that indirectly took away my grandfather's chance at life? The man who walked right past me in the pouring rain? Perhaps even he did not know which identity to claim. Right then, the sound of high heels clicked from the side door. Chloe walked in wearing a form-fitting black dress and a beige trench coat, clutching an elaborate bouquet of white leaves. Her makeup was subtle, her eyes already red as if she had been crying the entire ride there. She walked quickly toward me, lowering her voice. Elena, I was so shocked when I heard the news. I am truly so sorry about your grandfather. I looked at the bouquet in her hands and asked, are you here to pay respects or are you here to film a scene? Chloe flinched, then quickly shook her head. I didn't mean anything by it. She claimed she didn't know the equipment was that important, nor did she know my family needed it so desperately. Her voice trembled just the perfect amount, as if every word had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. I asked, you didn't know or you just never cared to know? Chloe bit her lip and replied, the project was already approved, I was just following the schedule. I took a step closer. A life-saving device was held back just so you could get close-up shots. You heard about it, and you honestly didn't think there was anything wrong with that? She reflexively looked toward Harrison. My voice turned to ice. I am asking you, do not look at him. Chloe snapped her head back, her eyes growing redder. She pleaded. Harrison and I only have a working relationship. I never wanted to fight with you over anything. Hearing that, I suddenly felt more exhausted than angry. There are people who will always play the victim, even when they are standing squarely on someone else's pain. I looked at her and asked, that night in the rain, you told me the man coming was your boyfriend. Who was that? Chloe's face drained of color. Harrison immediately took a half step forward while she scrambled to explain. I was just panicking. I misspoke. I just saw Harrison as someone I could trust. I let out a very faint laugh. You trusted him because you knew all it took was a single phone call and he would come. Chloe shook her head frantically. She looked at Harrison again, her eyes begging to be rescued. Seeing that gesture made my heart turn entirely cold. In 5 years, I had never once dared to look at my own husband with such a demanding gaze, but all she had to do was let her eyes turn a little red, fully confident someone would step up to shield her. My hand swung up before I could even think. The slap echoed sharply through the viewing room, instantly silencing the weeping and murmurs around us. Chloe's head whipped to the side, the bouquet dropping to the floor, white highs scattering across the tiles. She held her cheek, staring at me in utter disbelief, a tiny smear of blood appearing at the corner of her mouth, ruining her subtle lipstick. She burst into tears. You hit me. I stared at my own hand. My palm was burning, yet my emotions were remarkably serene. I said that slap was not for Harrison. That is the debt you owe my grandfather. She immediately cried out for Harrison. He stepped forward, his voice much heavier. Elena, this is a funeral home. Do you have any idea what you are doing? I turned to look at him. The man standing in front of me was still accustomed to using order and regulations to handle everything, even when a life had just been lost. I asked, does it hurt you to see her like this? He clenched his jaw, but didn't answer. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a stack of folded papers I had prepared beforehand. One copy was the divorce petition with my signature. The other was a copy of the official transfer order keeping the medical device for the PR project, complete with Harrison's signature and the base's official seal. I shoved both into his hands and said, you choose one. He looked down, his expression shifting ever so slightly. I continued, either you sign the divorce papers so we can end this quietly or I submit this transfer order to the Inspector General and demand a full federal investigation into the entire approval process. Harrison looked up. Are you threatening me? I shook my head. I am saving myself for the very last time. There were many military veterans in the room. None of them spoke up, but all eyes had shifted toward the document in Harrison's hand. He understood that this was no longer a domestic dispute. Misappropriating a strategic piece of medical equipment for a public relations stunt, while a civilian was in critical need, was an offense that warranted a massive internal review. Even if the initial paperwork followed procedure, the resulting tragedy could not be erased. Harrison lowered his voice. The project request was filed before your family asked for the machine. I replied, true, but when you found out my grandfather was waiting to die, you still chose to let the paperwork run out the clock. He insisted he had initiated a secondary review. I gave a bitter smile. Your tomorrow arrived after my grandfather was already dead. A long, heavy silence fell between us. I looked at Chloe being supported by someone nearby, then looked back at the man I had once loved so much that I lost myself entirely. 6 years ago, I packed my dreams into a storage room to step into this marriage. 5 years later, all I got in return was a scarred knee and a family member who couldn't survive the waiting period of standard operating procedure. I no longer had the strength to be the understanding wife. I pulled a photograph from my pocket. It was taken the day we signed our marriage license. In the photo, I was wearing the ivory dress, smiling so brightly, my eyes crinkled. Harrison stood next to me, his face stony, a small gap of space left between us. Back then, I thought time would eventually close that gap. Looking at it now, it felt like a blatant warning I had purposely ignored. I opened a small pair of scissors and cut the photo directly in half. I folded the half with me and put it in my pocket. The half with Harrison fell to the marble floor, spinning slightly before stopping near the toe of his polished shoe. I said, for 5 years, I lived like a ghost in your house. Starting today, I am returning you to exactly where you belong. Harrison stared at his severed image on the floor and asked, and where do you belong? His voice wasn't entirely freezing anymore. There was something resembling panic in it, but it came much too late. I replied, anywhere that isn't beside you. I turned back to the casket and bowed to Grandpa Arthur 3 times. The final time I looked up, I stared at his face and whispered very quietly, see, Grandpa. This time I am going to live my own life. I picked up my old backpack resting by the chairs and walked toward the exit. Maria started to follow, but I shook my head because I wanted to walk the rest of this path by myself. The mist outside was colder than it had been that morning. I walked down the steps slowly because my knees still ached whenever the weather turned bitter. No one called my name from behind. Or perhaps Harrison did call out, but that voice no longer possessed the power to make me turn around. Some breakups don't start when a person walks out the door. They start the exact moment that person stops, hoping the one behind them will chase after them. 3 days later, a lawyer delivered the signed divorce papers to Harrison's office. He signed them with the exact same fountain pen I had used the night I left. When the last stroke of ink dried, 5 years of marriage were reduced to nothing but a few sheets of paper with official red seals. I don't know what he was thinking in that moment. As for me, I was already sitting on a night train heading up into the Cascades, hugging my vintage backpack, watching the city fade away behind the glass. 6 years later, the name Elena Ramirez appeared on a massive screen during a briefing at the Northern Mountain Rescue Coordination Center. The profile picture showed a woman with short hair, a suntanned face, and calm, piercing eyes. Below it was a long list of landslide warning projects in Snoqualmie, Stevens Pass, and various high-altitude regions. That woman was drastically different from the girl who used to quietly brew coffee in a house in Seattle. But it was still me. 6 years is not a short amount of time. I started over from the absolute bottom in a geological survey team in the Cascades, where my first job was nothing more than logging data and hauling equipment. During those early days, my left knee hurt so badly I had to grind my teeth just to keep up with the crew. I never told anyone I used to be the wife of a high-ranking military officer up in the mountains. They only cared if I could accurately read a fissure and if I could stand my ground when the skies broke open. My old professor once asked if I regretted coming back to the field so late. I said no. But the truth was there were nights I lay in a cot with tears soaking my pillow. My college peers had advanced years ahead of me, and the technical knowledge I once knew so well had become outdated in places. I had to relearn everything from scratch, redo every report, and accept being corrected by people much younger than me. The strange thing was I never felt humiliated. After spending 5 years living to appease someone else, being allowed to fail because of my own choices felt incredibly liberating. Every callus on my hands was real. Every step forward, no matter how small, belonged to me. I no longer needed anyone to acknowledge how much I had sacrificed. By my 2nd year, I helped design an early warning system for a mountain town in Stevens Pass. A massive rainstorm that year severed multiple highways. But thanks to the advanced warning, over 100 families were evacuated in time. When I watched the children being brought down to safety, I cried for the first time since my grandfather's funeral. Those were no longer tears of loss. They were like a flood washing away the part of my life I had considered ruined. From that project, I was invited to join larger initiatives. I studied advanced rescue logistics, digital topography, and soil slip modeling. My colleagues gave me the nickname Glacier Elena because no matter how chaotic a disaster zone got, I would articulate every step with perfect clarity. Only those closest to me knew I wasn't actually cold. I had just learned how to stop letting fear dictate my decisions. Over those 6 years, Harrison was promoted and transferred to a northern command. He became a general overseeing joint rescue drills for several mountain estates. His rank was higher. His office was larger and his schedule was more packed than ever. He still lived alone. Whenever his duties took him back to Seattle, he would stay at the old house near the base. The house remained almost unchanged. His uniforms hung perfectly straight, but no one arranged them by schedule anymore. The old coffee press had been put away, and the faded water ring from a small potted plant still stained the wood of the study desk. In the bottom drawer lay an envelope containing half a wedding photo, showing only Harrison with his icy expression from 6 years ago. He used to think time would fade memories, but time only made him acutely aware of everything he once took for granted. No one restocked the medicine before it ran out. No one remembered the days his stomach cramped, and no one left a dim light on in the hallway when he came home late. Chloe no longer appeared by his side as often. After my grandfather's funeral, she tried to explain that she never meant to intrude on our marriage. Harrison did not argue, but he never gave her that old closeness back. Future PR projects were handed off to other departments. The connection that had caused me pain for years turned out to be so fragile that all it took was him taking one step back for it to dissolve entirely. One morning in early June, a planning meeting was held for an interagency rescue drill. The designated zone was near the Cascade Range, an area notorious for deep landslides and treacherous terrain. The civilian sector proposed bringing in an independent expert team to oversee geological safety. When the roster flashed on the screen, the pen in Harrison's hand stopped moving. The first line read, Elena Ramirez, Applied Geologist in Disaster Relief. The presenter went on to detail the projects I had been a part of. He mentioned the warning system in Stevens Pass, the evacuation protocol in Snoqualmie, and a post-flash flood rescue in Colorado. Every achievement was backed by hard data. Not a single line mentioned I was once Harrison Sterling's wife. On that screen, I stood entirely on my own merit. Harrison stared at the photo for a long time. My hair was shorter, my face leaner, the contours sharper than before. The eyes in the photo no longer held the waiting look he was accustomed to when the woman beside him called him General. He finally realized that the pen in his hand had snapped. A pool of black ink spreading across his white documents. He placed the broken pen down and said, Continue. His voice remained steady, but beneath the table, his hand formed a tight fist. The meeting ended after nearly an hour, and people filed out. He held Lieutenant Miller back. Over the past 6 years, Miller had stayed by his side and earned a higher rank. Harrison asked, When does the expert team arrive? Miller replied that they would be flying in via rescue chopper in 3 days. The sponsor and coordinating agency was the Mountain Safety Foundation, founded by Nolan Hayes. Harrison paused for a few seconds before ordering the highest tier of accommodation, transport, and reception. He explicitly added to check the dietary preferences and medical conditions of the team leader. Miller looked at him and stated, The primary contact is not Miss Ramirez. Harrison looked up. Miller continued, The direct coordinator is Mr. Nolan Hayes. According to the files, he has worked alongside Miss Ramirez for nearly 5 years. The room grew even quieter. Harrison simply replied, I am aware. That night, he returned to his military quarters later than usual. He opened the drawer and pulled out the torn photograph. His own cold face staring back made him feel like he was looking at a stranger. 6 years ago, I had cut myself out of his life with one clean slice of the scissors. 6 years later, he finally understood that the part discarded was not me. Harrison set the photo down and opened the digital file on the expert team. Right next to my name was Nolan Hayes, the founder of the Rescue Foundation and the primary financial backer for many of my projects. In a photo taken at a landslide site, Nolan stood next to me, draping his jacket over my shoulders. I was looking down at a map, but the corners of my mouth were slightly curled up. Harrison stared at that smile for a long time. He could not remember the last time I smiled at him like that. Maybe on our wedding day, or maybe even earlier, because during our final years, I only ever smiled to make the house feel less cold. In that moment, He realized he had spent 6 years waiting for someone to turn back, only to find she had walked so far, she wasn't even looking over her shoulder anymore. 3 days later, the expert team touched down on the Rescue Sense helipad at almost 9 inches the morning. I was sitting right by the window, looking down at the command center below gray corrugated roofs nestled in the valley, training routes winding along the mountain ridges. 6 years ago, just hearing Harrison's name made my chest ache like it was being crushed. This time I knew he was down there, but my heart only sank for a brief second before returning to normal. Perhaps time doesn't truly heal everything. It just makes you strong enough to touch the scar without bleeding. Nolan sat across from me, his hands resting on a binder packed with color-coded tabs. He glanced out the window and asked, "Do you need a minute to rest before the briefing?" I shook my head, double-checking the altimeter on my wrist. Nolan looked down at my left knee and reminded me, "When we land, do not jump out like the last few times." The doctor said, "Your joints aren't getting any younger, even if your temper is." I laughed out loud. "You make it sound like I'm 80. He replied completely deadpan. "An 80-year-old listens to directions better than you do." As soon as the chopper skids hit the tarmac, Nolan stepped out first, then turned and offered me his hand. He didn't say, "Take it," nor did he step so close that it felt invasive. Throughout our 5 years working together, Nolan always did exactly this. He placed his support right where I could see it, then left it entirely up to me whether I wanted it or not. I grabbed the frame of the cabin and stepped down on my own, but once my boots hit the ground, I tilted my head and said, "Thank you." Nolan pulled his hand back, the corner of his mouth turning up slightly. I didn't know that behind the glass of the command room, Harrison was standing and watching us. Lieutenant Miller later mentioned that Harrison had been standing there since the chopper was still hovering. He saw Nolan offer his hand, and he saw the small smile I gave the man beside me. A smile that in 5 years of marriage and 6 years of separation he couldn't remember receiving. We were escorted straight to the briefing room. Bottles of water and briefing packets were already set on the long conference table surrounded by representatives from rescue units and local government. Harrison stood near the projector screen in dark green tactical fatigues. 6 years had hardened the lines of his face. Silver strands now showed at his temples, but his eyes were exactly the same, deep and betraying nothing. When I walked in, his gaze lingered on my face longer than professional courtesy allowed. I held his stare for exactly 1 beat before turning to the officer introducing the agenda. That moment was so brief, no one else noticed. But I saw Harrison's hand tighten near his stack of files. Perhaps he had been waiting for a different reaction, whether anger or fluster. Lieutenant Miller stepped forward to welcome the team and introduced, "This is General Harrison Sterling, the commander of this drill." I nodded and extended my hand following basic protocol. "Good morning, General Sterling. I am Elena Ramirez, the lead geological expert for this team." Harrison stared at my hand for a few seconds before taking it. His hand was as warm as I remembered, while my palm now carried a thin layer of calluses from years of handling ropes and survey equipment. He said, "It has been a long time." I pulled my hand back and replied, "We can begin the briefing now." My answer made Lieutenant Miller shoot a quick glance at Harrison, but Nolan simply pulled out a chair for me in silence. He sat in the seat right next to me rather than standing behind me like a sponsor just there to observe. His presence didn't overshadow me, but it was prominent enough for everyone to know we shared equal authority. The meeting kicked off with a report from the military unit. Afterward, I took over the screen controls and presented a 3D model of the drill zone. I highlighted the weathered soil layers, fault lines, and 4 zones at high risk of deep sliding after heavy rain. A few people initially just flipped through the packets, but within minutes, everyone was looking up. My data didn't leave room for anyone to zone out. I stated that the western sector could not be used as a staging area. The weak soil layer sat nearly 6 feet deeper than the old data indicated. A local official asked if they could temporarily reinforce it to save time. I answered, "You can reinforce it for light vehicles in dry weather, but if rainfall exceeds 2 inches, no one is allowed to remain there." Harrison sat at the head of the table, his eyes never leaving the model. When I moved to the evacuation protocols, he asked several highly specific questions about landslide velocities and potential communications blackouts. I answered every single one without deflecting, and without yielding an inch just because of his rank. At one point, we debated for nearly 10 minutes over keeping a supply route open. Finally, Harrison capped his pen and said, "We follow the expert's recommendation." I realized this was the very first time in my life he publicly admitted my decision was worth prioritizing. After the meeting, the room slowly emptied. I was packing away my hard drive when Harrison called out. "Elena," I finished zipping my bag before turning around. "Is there something else, General Sterling?" He stepped closer, his expression slightly tense. "I want to speak to you privately about what happened in the past." I looked at him for a few seconds and replied, "Official business can be sent through the coordination channel," Harrison said. "I don't want to talk about official business." I gave a slight nod. "Then you can contact my lawyer." His face hardened. I continued, "Your time is valuable. Mine is too." Just as I turned to leave, Nolan walked in, carrying a cup of coffee and a small pastry bag. He set the cup in front of me and said, "Decaf Americano. No sugar. The pastry doesn't have raisins, so don't even try to inspect it." I checked my watch and asked, "Where did you even find this?" Nolan replied, "The mess hall." I used my most pathetic face to beg for it. I burst out laughing. Harrison stood just a few feet away, staring at the coffee cup in my hand. In 5 years of marriage, he only knew that I drank tea with him. He didn't know I preferred black coffee in the morning. Nor did he know I hated raisins so much I would pick them out of a pastry one by one. Those tiny details suddenly became razor sharp when remembered by another man. Nolan turned to Harrison and politely asked, "Does the general need further consultation with our expert?" Harrison replied, "This is a personal matter." Nolan nodded. "Then I'll wait outside." He didn't ask if I wanted to stay because he knew I would make my own choice. That very trust made Harrison even more uncomfortable. I slung my bag over my shoulder and said, "There is nothing left to discuss." Then I walked out with Nolan. After we had walked a bit, Nolan asked, "You okay?" I answered, "I'm fine." He looked at my stride and said, "You say you're fine, but you're shifting all your weight to your right leg." I stopped, then let out a helpless laugh. "Stop watching so closely, would you?" Nolan replied, "If I don't watch closely, how am I supposed to walk next to you?" That sentence wasn't overly sweet or cheesy, but it warmed my chest entirely. In the past, I lived next to a man where every sign of my pain had to be hidden. Now, someone could tell my knee was throbbing just by looking at how my boot hit the ground. Love sometimes isn't found in grand declarations. It is found in whether someone actually sees you. That afternoon, Harrison approached Nolan in the equipment inspection yard. He asked bluntly, "What exactly is your relationship with Elena?" Nolan didn't look annoyed. He checked a safety latch on a Pelican case before answering, "Partners and colleagues." Harrison pressed on, "Is that all?" Nolan looked at him, his voice steady. "I am pursuing her." Harrison's hand froze on his clipboard. Nolan added, "She hasn't said yes, and I am not forcing her." Harrison's voice turned icy. "How long are you going to wait?" Nolan gave a faint smile. "That is not the important question." He snapped the case shut and looked Harrison dead in the eye. "She is not a trophy for the winner to claim. I just want it so that when she eventually turns around, she knows I am still standing right there." With that, he walked away, leaving Harrison standing alone in a yard filled with roaring machinery. From a distance, I saw the two of them, but couldn't hear the conversation. Nolan walked over to me and handed me the jacket he was carrying. He said the temperature would drop fast and my knee wouldn't handle the mountain wind. I took it and asked, "What did you say to make him look at you like he wants to throw you in the brig?" He answered completely seriously, "I was merely presenting a perspective on basic human rights." I laughed so hard I had to turn my face away. Behind us, Harrison was still standing in the exact same spot. 6 years ago, I waited for him to see me. 6 years later, when he finally looked my way, I was standing next to a man who didn't require me to shrink myself just to be loved. Chloe arrived at the center on the 4th morning with a PR crew of nearly 10 people. She had been invited to participate in a disaster awareness program to promote civilian safety skills. 6 years had stripped away some of her youthful innocence, but her grand entrance hadn't changed. Her outfit was meticulously chosen to look ruggedly professional yet camera-ready. The moment she stepped out of the van, she scanned the area as if looking for a familiar face. When she spotted Harrison near the command tent, Chloe immediately walked over. She called out, "Harrison, it's been so long." Her voice was still as soft as before, but Harrison merely nodded and asked if the safety officer had briefed her on the protocols. Chloe looked visibly deflated. Perhaps she still thought that just by showing up, her old position would naturally be restored to her. Harrison explicitly told her which zones were cleared for filming and which were strictly off-limits. He also demanded that her crew remain with a military guide at all times. Chloe smiled sweetly and replied, "I know you're just as strict as you used to be." She deliberately dragged the past out in front of everyone, but Harrison didn't take the bait. He simply turned to Lieutenant Miller and ordered him to check everyone's clearance badges. I ran into Chloe in the mess hall at noon. She was standing near the beverage station. Her eyes dropped to the scar visible below my pant leg, then quickly darted back up to my face. After a few seconds, she smiled. "Elena, it has been far too long." I grabbed a food tray and replied, "You can refer to me as Miss Ramirez. We are on the clock." Chloe maintained her smile, but the corners of her mouth stiffened. She said she had wanted to reach out to apologize for the past, but couldn't find my contact info. I asked, "Apologize for which part?" She paused for a beat before saying, "About the rainy night and your grandfather." Coming from her mouth, those two events sounded as trivial as two missed lunch dates. I sat down at a table near the window. Nolan walked over with a bowl of hot soup and set it in front of me. He said, "The chef said there's pepper in it, so I had them swap it for a fresh batch." I looked at the bowl and asked where his food was. Nolan replied, "I'll eat later. You take your meds first." Chloe sat down across from us, completely uninvited. She looked at Nolan and asked, "You're Nolan Hayes, right? I read an article about your foundation." Nolan gave a polite nod, but said nothing more. He simply opened my pill organizer and placed an anti-inflammatory tablet next to my cup of warm water. That natural gesture made Chloe's expression shift. She turned to me and said, "You're so lucky. Everywhere you go, someone takes care of you." I stirred my soup and answered, "It's not luck. I just learned how to pick better people." The smile on her face vanished for a second. Nolan looked down, hiding a chuckle by taking a sip of water. A crew member called Chloe over to test a camera angle. She stood up way too fast, her elbow knocking into the cup of water on the table. The water spilled straight onto the topographical maps and data sheets I had just printed. Chloe instantly grabbed napkins and gasped, "Oh my God. I am so sorry. I am so clumsy." But the cup was positioned too far from her arm for that bump to be entirely accidental. I grabbed her wrist and said, "Don't wipe it, you'll just smear the ink." Chloe pulled her hand back, looking perfectly innocent. I called a tech officer over to take photos of the damage and requested the massage security footage. She froze. "It is just a few pieces of paper." I replied, "This is safety data. Losing one decimal point here can cost human lives." Harrison walked in exactly at that moment. He looked at the soaked documents and asked what happened. Chloe quickly chimed in, claiming it was an accident. I didn't argue. I simply requested to review the cameras. Harrison turned to Lieutenant Miller and ordered it checked immediately. Chloe looked at him, acting incredibly hurt. "You don't believe me," Harrison replied. "This isn't about believing or not believing." It was the exact phrase he used to say to me. But this time, it didn't cause me pain. I just found it amusing that some people have to pay a massive price before they learn to apply their rules in the right place. The footage showed Chloe shifting the cup closer to the papers right before standing up. The action wasn't glaring enough to definitively prove intent, but it was enough to prove severe negligence. Harrison ordered her not to sit anywhere near documentation zones and assigned an officer to monitor her crew's every move. Chloe glared at me, her eyes full of venom. I knew that anger didn't stem from a few sheets of paper. It stemmed from the fact that the man who once shielded her against the world was no longer doing so. But Harrison's change of heart didn't move me. When he walked over and offered to have all the documents reprinted immediately, I replied, "You don't need to defend me." Harrison stopped short. I continued, "I have my own protocols and I am perfectly capable of protecting myself." He stated he was just doing his duty. I looked at him and said, "Then just do your duty. Don't turn it into some form of compensation." His face darkened. I knew I was being cold, but I had absolutely no desire to accept any delayed kindness as a debt I was supposed to be grateful for. That afternoon, Chloe was assigned to film at the primary rescue simulation zone. She followed instructions for the first 2 scenes, but constantly complained that the footage wasn't dramatic enough. The director suggested the terrain further up the mountain looked better, but the military guide shot it down because it was past the warning perimeter. Chloe didn't argue in front of them. She just stared silently at the mountain ridge marked with keep out signs. That night, I reviewed the precipitation data and discovered the soil moisture was spiking rapidly. I sent an alert to the coordination channel requesting a recheck of 3 monitoring stations first thing in the morning. Nolan looked at the readouts and said, "If it rains one more night, the entire northern route has to be shut down." I nodded. In our line of work, disasters rarely announce themselves with massive explosions. They start with a few skewed numbers that impatient people brush off as insignificant. Around that same time, Chloe told her crew they were doing a special sunrise shoot the next morning. She claimed that going up just a few hundred feet higher would give them a panoramic view of the valley and the footage would go viral. A young cameraman reminded her the area was restricted. Chloe replied, "We shoot fast and come right back. No one will even know." Another crew member asked nervously, "What if we get caught?" Chloe smiled. "I will take full responsibility." She said it so lightly because her entire life, someone else had always been there to carry the consequences for her. None of them knew that beneath the wet topsoil on that ridge, a brand new fault line was silently tearing its way across the exact zone they planned to enter. Near midnight, my monitoring equipment pinged an anomaly. The displacement index at Station 7 had tripled in less than 2 hours. I sprang out of bed and called Nolan. The second he answered, I said, "I'm heading to the control room now." I threw on my jacket and stepped into the hallway. The rain outside was coming down harder, the drops hammering the metal roof like thousands of fingertips drumming relentlessly. I stared at the red flash on my phone screen, a cold chill running down my spine. Station 7 was located right above the area Chloe had been staring at all afternoon. At 3:12 inches the morning, the early warning system blared continuously inside the command center. As soon as I walked in, I saw all 3 monitoring points on the ridge shift from yellow to critical red. Nolan stood in front of the main screen, his hands flying across the data layers. Station 7 is sliding laterally. Velocity is up nearly 400%. I looked at the cumulative rainfall and felt the skin around my knee go taut. These numbers weren't forecasts anymore. They were a guarantee that the entire mountainside could give way at any second. I called Harrison while jogging over to the command tent. He picked up instantly, his voice sharp and alert despite just waking up. "What's the situation?" I clearly stated that 3 stations had breached critical thresholds with Station 7 sitting directly above the northern transport route. Harrison asked how many sectors needed to be locked down. I answered, "Shut down the entire northern route, evacuate the tech crews, and move the staging camp out from the base of the slope before 0600. He paused for 2 seconds before saying, "I'll issue the order." When we arrived at the command tent, a few officers still argued against immediate evacuation, claiming the rain showed signs of letting up. The logistics commander stated there were 3 vehicles full of equipment still up there. If they shut down the route, the entire drill would be delayed by at least 2 days. Harrison looked at me and asked, "Can we hold the personnel back for 1 hour to extract the gear?" I pointed at the displacement curve on the monitor. "No one knows if we have an hour or if we have 10 minutes. The logistics commander tried to argue that the cargo included incredibly expensive comms, relays, and specialized gear. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Only living people can replace equipment. Hardware is not worth trading lives for." The room fell dead silent. Harrison stared at me for a very long time, perhaps because he realized I wasn't just talking about the trucks at the base of the mountain. 6 years ago, a piece of equipment was valued higher than my grandfather's life. He turned to Lieutenant Miller and ordered a total evacuation. Sirens echoed across the camp while it was still pitch black outside. Rescue teams were woken up and moved out along predefined routes. Nolan and I went to the data hub to track the slide velocity. My knee throbbed sharper as the temperature plummeted, but I didn't stop. At nearly 5 inches the morning, a communications officer rushed in, reporting they couldn't reach Chloe's crew. According to the manifest, they were supposed to be at the rally point, but 4 people were missing. I pulled up their last GPS ping and saw the signal had stopped right near Station 7. Ice flooded my veins. Chloe had taken her crew straight into the red zone. Harrison tried them on the radio repeatedly with no response. A cameraman left behind at the camp shakily confessed that Chloe had wanted to go up high to shoot the sunrise. They had hiked out past 4 inches the morning using a back trail. Harrison slammed his fist onto the table and ordered spin up a search team. I instantly grabbed a topographic map and marked 3 approach vectors. Nolan tried to stop me. "You stay in the control room. I will lead the team up." I shook my head. "You can't read the microterrain as fast as I can." He looked at my knee and lowered his voice. "You don't have to be the first one through the door every single time." I replied, But this time, I am the only one who knows which sections still have bedrock. Harrison also objected. He stated that due to heavy rain and destabilized terrain, I only needed to guide them remotely. I looked at him and asked, if radio comms go down, who plots the escape route? He had no answer. Finally, Nolan sighed, grabbed a rescue harness, and knelt down to adjust my knee brace. He said, if you go, you follow my pace. I told him, don't give me orders like a commander. Nolan pulled the straps tight and said, I am currently begging a very stubborn woman to keep herself alive. Despite the suffocating tension, I let out a soft laugh. Just a brief sound, but enough to stop his hands from trembling. The search team of 8 moved out just as the sky began to lighten. Harrison took the rear while Nolan stayed on my left to monitor my footing. The trail had turned into liquid mud. Every step felt like the earth was giving way beneath my boots. I constantly checked for new fissures and water runoff directions. After nearly 40 minutes, we heard cries for help from a rocky alcove. A young cameraman was pinned near a tree trunk, his leg crushed under a heavy equipment case. 2 others were desperately trying to pull him free. Chloe stood nearby, her face deathly pale, her clothes caked in mud. The second she saw Harrison, she burst into tears and ran toward him. Harrison, I knew you would come. Harrison did not catch her like he did 6 years ago. He simply demanded to know who else was missing and who was injured. Chloe sobbed that one assistant had slid further down and the cameraman couldn't walk. I cut her off. Cry later. Listen to my orders if you still want to live. Chloe stared at me, stunned. I ordered the 2 lightest team members to move toward the bedrock shelf on the right, strictly avoiding the gray-colored soil zone. Nolan and the rescue crew lifted the heavy case off the victim. Harrison hoisted the man onto his back and carried him out of the alcove. Chloe was still frozen in panic, so I grabbed her wrist and dragged her forward. Through her tears, she asked, "Don't you hate me?" I didn't turn around. "I hate that you treat human lives like a game, but I am not going to let you die just to prove I am right." She slipped once and clamped onto my arm. I didn't push her away. Suddenly, the warning signal on my handheld device switched to a continuous high-pitched screech. Nolan looked at the screen and yelled, "The upper shelf is going." Everyone broke into a sprint. From the mountainside above came a deep rumbling groan like a massive underground vault door being wrenched open. Mud and small boulders began spilling across our path. Just as we dragged the first group onto the solid bedrock, an earth-shattering boom erupted behind us. The upper shelf collapsed, completely obliterating the exact spot they had been standing on less than a minute prior. Chloe collapsed to her knees in pure terror. Harrison pulled her up, shoved her toward Lieutenant Miller, and whipped his head around to look for me. I was staring at the data feed from a portable relay station. One sensor lower down was still transmitting live data, but its anchor line was shifting. If it got swept away, we would lose all ability to predict the secondary slide. I handed my radio to Nolan and said, "I have to get that relay to safe ground." He grabbed my shoulder. "No." I pointed at the screen. "If we lose the data stream, the teams below won't know when the second wave hits." Nolan argued we could abandon the gear. I shook my head. "It's not just gear. It is the lifeline for over 30 people down there." Before he could stop me, I turned and ran back. Harrison sprinted after me. He screamed my name, but the roar of shifting earth drowned it out. I grabbed the anchor line and shimmied toward the relay hanging near the edge. The ground beneath me was so soft, my boots sank deep into the mud. Just as I unclipped the carabiner, the earth to my right gave way. My entire body slid toward the precipice. I managed to grab a thick tree root, but my left knee smashed violently against a rock. The blinding pain sapped almost all the strength from my hands. Harrison lunged forward and grabbed my wrist. He lay flat on his stomach in the mud, one hand gripping a rope, the other pulling me up. I looked at his face, mere inches from mine. The rain poured over his eyes, and the gaze that was usually so cold was now filled with sheer panic. He yelled, "Let go of the relay." I kept my death grip on the tether line. "No, the upload isn't finished." Harrison gritted his teeth. "Elena, let go." In that split second, the rainy night from 6 years ago flashed through my mind. I was trapped in my car and he had walked away. Now his hand was crushing my wrist, holding on so desperately it was as if letting go would cost him everything. But his guilt could not replace rescue protocol. A rope dropped down from above. Nolan locked a carabiner to a sturdy trunk and rappelled down next to us. He didn't lunge in blindly. He checked the anchor's load capacity first, then quickly strapped a rescue harness around my waist. He spoke loudly and clearly, "Elena, look at me. Let go with your left hand and grab the chest lock." I did as Nolan said. He shifted my weight onto the main line and signaled the team above to pull. Harrison didn't let go of my wrist until my body cleared the ledge. When I collapsed onto the solid rock, he finally released me, his hands shaking violently. Nolan didn't ask if I was hurt. He knelt down, checked my pupils, and ran his hands around my knee to locate the injury. He stared at me for a very long time before saying, "You owe me an apology for this one." I gasped for air, forcing a breath. "I'll apologize when we get down," he replied. "I'm charging interest." The relay was still hanging on the end of the line. I ordered the team to haul it up because the data confirmed the secondary slide would hit in approximately 20 minutes. Harrison didn't argue anymore. He immediately issued the command for all remaining units to clear the hazard zones. Thanks to that signal, the teams at the base of the mountain evacuated just before the second wave of mud and rock came crashing down. By the time we made it back to camp, the sun was fully up. The rain was still falling, but much lighter. Chloe was sitting in the back of an ambulance, clutching a hot cup of water, her flawless makeup completely ruined. She watched as I was carried off the stretcher and burst into tears. This time, the crying wasn't a calculated act. It was the raw, genuine terror of someone who finally understood she had nearly dragged several people to their deaths. I didn't say a word to her. Nolan walked beside the stretcher, one hand holding an IV bag, the other resting on the metal rail, so I knew he was still there. Harrison walked a few paces behind. His face was paler than the people who had just been rescued, and his right hand was smeared with blood from being sliced open on the rocks when he pulled me up. The doctor at the field tent diagnosed my left knee with a severe sprain and further cartilage tearing, though not bad enough to require immediate surgery. I had to keep it immobilized for a few days and get an MRI when I transferred to a major hospital. Nolan stood nearby, absorbing every word, then asked detailed questions about medications and observation schedules. Harrison stood outside the curtain for the entire time, never stepping in, even though no one stopped him. I clear's throat knew he was there because his shadow was cast against the thin fabric. When the doctor left, Nolan set a cup of warm water on the table and pulled a blanket over my legs. He didn't bring up my reckless dive toward the relay. His silence made me feel guiltier than any lecture ever could. I said softly, "I'm sorry." He looked at me and asked, "Sorry for what?" I replied, "For not listening to you." Nolan shook his head. "I don't need you to follow orders. I need you to remember that your own life is also on the list of things you are supposed to save." Those words made my throat tighten. For years, I had learned how to save others. But deep down, I still possessed the habit of viewing myself as expendable. I smiled to hide my emotions. "You sound like a motivational poster." Nolan pulled up a chair and sat down. "Then next time I'll print it on a t-shirt so you can read it." I let out a laugh. But the moment I did, my eyes burned. He didn't pry. He just rested his hand on the edge of the bed right where I could reach it if I wanted to. That afternoon, the command staff held an emergency meeting regarding the actions of Chloe's crew. Dashcam footage and testimonies confirmed she had explicitly demanded they cross the safety perimeter. Leaked behind-the-scenes videos even caught her, saying Harrison would handle it if anything went wrong. Those clips spread faster than she ever anticipated. Her PR contract was instantly terminated, and federal agencies demanded a full investigation into her liabilities. Chloe asked to see me before she left the base. She walked in on trembling legs, no makeup, her eyes swollen red. She stopped a few feet from my bed and said, "I'm sorry," I asked. "For today or for everything from years ago?" She looked down. After a moment, she confessed that she used to think as long as she had Harrison's attention, nothing else mattered. She knew he was married. But since it was kept secret, she convinced herself it wasn't real. She loved the thrill of calling an icy, untouchable man and watching him drop everything to rush to her. It made her believe she was special. I listened to all of it, then asked, "Did you love him?" Chloe stayed silent for a long time before answering. "I think I just loved being chosen by him." I looked at the woman standing in front of me, and suddenly, I wasn't angry anymore. She had caused me pain, but she was just someone trying to find her worth in a man's eyes. The only difference between us was that I had managed to walk away in time. I said, "Me saving you doesn't mean everything is forgiven." Chloe nodded, tears falling again. I continued, "You need to take responsibility for the people who followed you. Stop crying, expecting people to go soft on you." This time, She didn't argue. She bowed her head slightly and walked out of the tent. That evening, Harrison finally stepped inside. He had changed his uniform, but the cuts on his hand were only haphazardly bandaged. He stood near the entrance for a few seconds before asking, "Can we talk?" I looked at the empty chair across from me and nodded. He sat down, but his posture lacked the rigid perfection he maintained in every meeting. Harrison looked at the long scar on my knee. The old tissue cutting diagonally across the newly swollen skin was too glaring to ignore. He asked that night, "How badly did it hurt?" I knew he was talking about the car crash 6 years ago. I replied, "It hurt so much I stopped wishing you would come back." His hands clenched. He said he had thought endlessly about that rainy night, about how he only looked at my crushed car for 2 seconds before turning away. He used to tell himself he was just doing triage because Chloe was panicking and the accident victim was being handled by his lieutenant. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he had made his choice before he even saw the driver. He had chosen the person who called him first. Harrison said, "I am so sorry I didn't recognize you." I looked at him and said, "It wasn't that you didn't recognize me. You never even knew what car I drove." That sentence made his head drop. Years ago, I wanted him to feel pain when he finally realized that. Now, seeing him truly hurting didn't make me feel any lighter. He apologized for the marriage contract, for the forbidden phone calls and for the dinners he never ate with me. He apologized for treating my care as an automatic built-in feature of his house. Finally, he brought up my grandfather, his voice cracking as he said, "I relied too much on refusing to break the rules." I replied, "The rules weren't the problem. Using them as a shield to avoid taking responsibility was the problem." Harrison looked up. I continued, "You had the authority to initiate an emergency override, but you were terrified people would think you were playing favorites. You kept your pristine objective reputation, and my grandfather died." He didn't argue. After a heavy silence, he asked, "I thought following the procedure perfectly made me the one in the right." I looked out the tent window. In a command center, maybe, but in a relationship, people don't survive on procedures. He closed his eyes for a few seconds, letting out a very slow breath. He asked if there was any chance we could start over. He asked it in a softer voice than I had ever heard from him. 6 years ago, if he had asked me that, I probably would have dropped everything to go back. But the woman sitting in this hospital bed was no longer the girl waiting for the sound of a key in the door every night. I said, "I am not turning you down because of Nolan." Harrison looked at me. I continued, "Even if he wasn't here, I wouldn't go back." He asked, "Because you don't love me anymore?" I stayed quiet for a moment before answering, "Because I am no longer someone who can survive in that house." Harrison reached into his chest pocket and pulled out an envelope. Inside was the half of the wedding photo I had left on the floor of the funeral home. The paper was worn, the edges smeared with fingerprints from being handled far too many times. He placed it on the table and said, "I kept this for 6 years." I looked at his cold face in the photo and felt absolutely no pain. He asked if I wanted to take it back. I picked up the photo and slid it into the side pocket of my file folder. Harrison watched me do it, a brief flash of hope in his eyes. I said, "I am putting this in my personal archives. It is a piece of the past, not a promise." The light in his eyes faded very slowly. Before leaving the tent, Harrison stopped at the flap and said, "I still want to wait." I replied, "That is your choice, but do not make it my burden." He nodded. For the very first time, he accepted a boundary I set without trying to maneuver around it. When the tent flap closed, Nolan walked in a few minutes later. He didn't ask what we had talked about. He just looked at the empty spot on the table and asked, "Do you need me to go burn something?" I laughed. "Aren't you curious?" Nolan pulled a chair up and answered, "I am, but respecting you is more important." I looked at his hand resting near the edge of the bed. After a moment, I placed my hand on top of his. Nolan didn't grip it too tightly. He just closed his fingers just enough to hold on. I used to think healing meant forgetting everything that happened. Now I understand that healing is remembering it all, yet still being able to peacefully hold someone else's hand. 3 months later, the first early warning landslide system was officially handed over to the town situated below the drill zone. 6 new monitoring stations became permanent fixtures. The data fed directly into the county emergency management office, and locals were trained on evacuation protocols. The project wrapped up 2 weeks behind schedule, but nobody complained. After the near disaster, Everyone realized that a system that saves lives is worth infinitely more than a flawless drill on paper. I was back on my feet after physical therapy. My knee still achy when the weather turned cold, but my doctor cleared me for field work as long as I paced myself. Nolan bought me a brand new trekking pole and slapped a label on the shaft that read Priority Rescue Asset. I looked at it and asked if he felt a little childish. He replied, "No, I feel like an excellent educator." Harrison was transferred to command a different program after the project handover. A day before he left, he sent a short letter to me via Lieutenant Miller. The letter didn't ask me to come back. It simply stated that he had initiated a federal review of military medical equipment allocations, instituting a fast-track override protocol for critical civilian emergencies. He knew it wouldn't bring my grandfather back, but at least his old mistake wouldn't be repeated with another family. I finished reading and folded the letter. Nolan was standing nearby, but didn't ask. I said, "He finally figured out what actually needed fixing." Nolan replied, "That's a good thing." I looked at him. "You're not jealous?" He shrugged. "I can be jealous of the present. Fighting with the past just sounds exhausting." That afternoon, we hiked up to the highest point of the monitoring route for a final inspection. From up there, we could see the tiny roofs nestled in the valley, and the newly reinforced road winding along the mountain. I stood in front of the warning station named after Grandpa Arthur, my hand resting on the cold metal plaque. My family had agreed to let the local equipment grant be named in his honor. I whispered, "See, Grandpa? I finally made it to the top of a real mountain." The wind blew past, lightly tossing my hair. In that moment, I remembered the girl who wrote that sentence in her geology journal and buried it at the bottom of a storage box. It took me a 10-year detour to finally reach the place I had always wanted to go. But at least I made it in time. Nolan stood a few steps away. He didn't intrude on the quiet space between me and my grandfather. It was only when I turned around that he stepped forward and handed me a small box. I looked at him suspiciously. "Don't tell me that's a ring." He laughed out loud. "Do I look like a man with a death wish?" Inside the box was a small brass compass. The back was engraved, "Never lose yourself no matter where you go." I brushed my thumb over the engraving and asked, "A project completion gift?" Nolan shook his head. He looked at me, his gaze calm, but much more serious than usual. He said, "I don't know where else your work will take you." I stayed silent, listening. He continued, "And I don't want to use a promise to tie you down, but if you'll let me, I would like to walk alongside you for a very long time." There were no flowers, no music, and no crowd clapping around us. Just the sound of the mountain wind and a compass growing warm in the palm of my hand. I asked, "What if I rush back into a hazard zone?" Nolan replied, "I'll pull you out first, then yell at you later." I asked, "What if I don't want to get married anytime soon?" He said, "Then we don't." I looked at him. "What if I want to deploy on a field assignment tomorrow morning?" He sighed, "Then I'll have to get much better at working remotely." I burst out laughing. This time, the smile didn't require any effort, and there wasn't a single trace of pain hiding behind it. Nolan didn't ask for a verbal answer. He just stood there, patient as always, offering his hand, but never forcing me to take it. Because of that, I took the step forward myself. I slipped the compass into my pocket and grabbed his hand. Nolan looked down at our hands with a rare look of pleasant surprise. I said, "A very long time sounds good," he asked. "Any conditions?" I replied, "You do not get to make decisions for me." Nolan nodded with absolute sincerity. "Agreed," then he added, "But you also don't get to treat your own life like a consumable supply." I smiled and squeezed his hand. "That I will try to work on." Down in the valley, the test siren for the early warning system rang out 3 times before falling silent. The townspeople had been notified in advance, so there was no panic. Kids playing in the schoolyard just looked up, then went right back to running around. That sound used to be tied to sheer terror. But today, it felt like a reminder that people can learn to protect each other before it is too late. Harrison left the command center the next morning. Through the window of his Tahoe, he saw Nolan and me inspecting a sensor array near the ridgeline. He didn't step out of the vehicle, nor did he wait for Lieutenant Miller to ask if they should stop. Harrison shook his head and said, "Not anymore." The black SUV drove down the mountain pass, slowly disappearing behind the tree. I saw it from afar, but didn't stop my work. There are people who were once your entire world, who ultimately become nothing more than a car fading over the horizon, not because they were never important, but because life continues even after they leave your line of sight. I bent down to adjust the sensor housing. Nolan stood behind me, anchoring the safety line, reminding me not to put too much pressure on my left leg. I turned around and asked, "Are you really planning on micromanaging me for the rest of my life?" He smashed. "I'm applying for a permanent position here." I replied, "You're on probation. We'll have to see how you perform." We hiked down the mountain together just as the late afternoon sun brushed the rooftops in the valley. The brass compass in my pocket gently bumped against my chest with every step. A compass needle always points north, but I knew my life no longer needed a single rigid direction. The only thing that mattered was that no matter where I went, I would always recognize myself. After spending so many years as a shadow in someone else's house, I was finally standing under my own sky, under my own